Hey, hello. Susan Flory here with expert help with one aim alone on this episode of The Big Middle to help you better manage your frazzled mental state. We're recording this 35 days after Russian President Vladimir Putin started his savagery in Ukraine, throwing all of us into a new state of psychic trauma. I'm betting that you too have been finding it really difficult to wrestle your emotions, to balance your seesawing feelings about the war, about the conflict in Syria still going on. We've taken our eyes off that a little bit. So I've got one of my most popular guests back on to give us some guidance on that. It's Dr. Happy Andy Cope. How are you?
I'm exceptionally well, thank you. Thanks for asking. Yes, and the happy T-shirt gives you a clue. And what you just alluded to is the fact that the world is a little bit rough and tough at the moment, rumbly tumbly. So I think maybe some a discussion around how we can stay happy, or is it even right to be happy in the
Yeah,
world as it is?
all of that,
Yeah.
because I can't thank you enough for rushing to the rescue because I know that you've had a busy day and I was teaching all day, but I think this is really important to tackle because so many people, everywhere I go, people are talking about this and the gut-wrenching scenes that we're seeing. And, we need to deploy all of our resilience, even if we're not directly affected by this. 2 years, we already had the collective trauma of
Mm.
COVID. That was just beginning to fade. And the timing, I mean, you couldn't make it up, really.
No, it is. In fact, before we talk about happiness and well-being and positivity, can I just delve into your backstory just very briefly? Because I know, because what we do as viewers, we tune into the news and we watch these atrocities beamed live into our living room 24/7. But you were on the reporting end of that for a while. So I strongly suspect that what we're seeing is a sanitized version, and people like you at the front end of the news are seeing the real thing. Would that be true?
Well, the thing is, I have to say, I never went to war zones. All of the documentaries I did out in the field, trotting around, I did a lot of summitry, G8, all just rushing around the world because, I'm in my 60s now. So I was doing that in my 20s and my 30s, and I did a lot of international news programming. And it was before, it was in analog. When I worked at Euronews as a chief editor, I was making the soup. And we had electronic news gathering at the time.
Mm.
And you'd have all of these heavy analog 3/4 inch tapes. And I'd be going into my booth. We didn't have a editor at the time. So I'd be getting the feeds as they're happening. The agency camera people or one of the European public broadcasters. There used to be anyway, I'm getting rambly. There's so many
Well,
tangents to this. But the thing is, we see the raw video that comes in. I think a lot of international news journalists that are not even on the front line but are massaging the news and reporting it and putting it out instantly. You see the aftermath of the Sarajevo bread market bombing in 1995. You see the immediate aftermath of Benazir Bhutto's assassination in 2007 in Rawalpindi. I mean, nothing is edited. You get the raw footage, and it's up to you to do what you need to do to quickly do the edit, get it out, or if you're a chief editor like I am, do it yourself or get somebody else to do it. And it's raw. So I have found it really difficult because I'm not working in a newsroom anymore, and I've pulled back from all of that. But I have found it. I've been alternating between being hypervigilant, not being able to look away, not doom scrolling, just making myself aware of all facets of the conflict, and then alternating between screaming at Instagram because you got the pointers and the people gurning at the camera and pointing, and it's also inconsequential. And I just found it incredible that people could be on autopilot and carry on as usual. I kept screaming at the screen, going, "Don't you know there's a war on? How can you not even take a beat?"
Well, this is it. But I mean, you've got these things because you were saying making the soup, which is a kind of fantastic phrase, really. You're making it palatable for people like us who watch it, right? If we watch the full atrocity, like the people in Ukraine are living it, then we'd all be having PTSD. So I'm
Yeah.
doffing my cap to the news people at the moment and the people like you who are making the soup, who are
I
bringing
think
it
more
to
and
us the
more of
news.
it. Well, that's very kind. I mean, I take the doffed cap, but for all of the fearless people out there at the in Lviv and watching the television tower get blown up. I mean, there's just so much horror and suffering, and so
Yeah.
many of the searing images that have come out of the news coverage of this. I mean, chapeau to everyone who's out there and everyone who's dealing
Yeah.
with the stuff that gets beamed back into newsrooms and instantly put out. So it's just a lot of trauma. But I mean, this is it's finding the balance. I mean, I've backed away. I won't watch the 10 o'clock news now. I'll
Mm.
listen to radio news, but I'm just protecting myself from too much. I've had
Yeah.
ratchet back on that to ration my news consumption. Have you been doing the same?
Yeah, I have been, and I'm like you. I listen to the radio news, as I find that I find somehow I'm an auditory person, so I find that more informative anyway. But I think there's lots of evidence to say that I think what we spoke about last time actually. If you very quickly give you my background in case people didn't hear our previous podcast, is I've spent 20 years researching positive psychology, the science of happiness, and the science of well-being. So essentially, what I did was flip psychology on its head, and after the psychological profession has spent 150 years looking at illness and mental disorders and anxiety and depression and PTSD and all the things that could go wrong with people. What I did was I looked at what could go right with people. I looked at the happy people, the flourishing few, the ones who slip through the net academically and medically. So there's all of us can think of a handful of people in our life who've got something extra. And whether that's an extra smile on their face, an extra spring in their step, an extra resilience, an extra bounce, an extra sort of um, well, in the workplace, these are work colleagues who go the extra mile. So, what these people are very rarely ill. So, because they're feeling amazing, they've got energy, they've got positivity, they've got passion. So, traditional psychology has never looked at them because they're functioning really well. So, what
Yeah.
I decided to do is flip it on its head and come at it from the sort of statistical outliers on a happiness graph, really. So, the handful of people we can all think of, like who are they? What are they doing that allows them to flourish, even in a world that has gone a little bit crazy at the moment? And thirdly, most importantly, is what could we then learn from them that we could apply to us so we might also have a chance of feeling a little bit better. And I think when the world's doing its worst, which it has been, like you've just articulated for 2.5 years, whatever, when it's doing its worst, it's even more important that we understand how to be at our best. So what I'm picking up, going out doing keynotes and webinars all over the world now, is that everybody's exhausted. We're
Yeah.
just absolutely ground down by not only just 2 years of a pandemic, but then straight into a war in Ukraine. In fact, there's a Finnish word. I don't know if you saw there's the International League Tables of Happiness were released about 2 weeks ago. And
Missed those.
Finland is again the number one, third year on the bounce. Finland is there, and the Finns, they've got a word, a very small word but a very powerful word, and the word is sisu, and sisu sort of means fortitude or resilience, or it's like when the world is doing its worst, and like when you've got something to go through in life and you're not sure you can do it, but somehow you dig super deep and
Yeah.
you plow on through even against the odds. You somehow get through this trauma and this test that life has sent you. So sisu is like your reserve tank, your inner strength, your grit, your resilience, your perseverance. It's continuing to go forward when the world is battering you. And I think right now there's a lot of people running on empty, and we need to find our sisu, our reserve tank, to keep us going.
No, absolutely. And we need to take care of ourselves and fuel ourselves. And I felt really out of balance the first couple of weeks of this. And now we've settled more into a bit of a cycle. And, it's funny you mentioned Finland because they're now, talking about, oh, do we need to join NATO? So, I mean, all of it geopolitically, fascinating, worrying, gut-wrenching scenes, all of that. Now, I'm wondering though, your Art of Brilliance team, you do the workshops all around the world to help everyone. You spread the power of positivity and you wrap it all up so beautifully with some comic touches. Is it a tough sell now for you?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
are people saying, come on, you're talking about happiness when the world's falling apart?
yeah. I think we're toning down that. I think is it even appropriate to be happy right now? We could have that debate, and I'm not absolutely sure that it is. I mean, it depends when your people are watching and listening to this podcast. I mean, you might listen to it in 5 years' time when all this has gone. I don't know, but the truth is, it is a tough time to be happy right now. I think, and I've been doing a lot of media interviews at the moment where actually been quite aggressively questioned by the news reporter saying, should we not should we not feel guilty if we're feeling happy? What right have we got to be happy when the world is suffering? And I think that's a fair comment. I think maybe happiness is a stretch at the moment. But I think there's related emotions like optimism and hope and positivity that are not necessarily happiness, but that's what the world needs right now is some sort of fortitude and positivity. So I think that hope and optimism are the two things that I'm going to hang on to, and they will give me a better chance of being happy, but not a guarantee.
But I want you to open your bag of tricks because you got loads. You spent 12 years studying happiness for your PhD. You've got coping mechanisms that you can offer us for every scenario, the 4 minute rule, the everyday Olympics. I mean, how do we deploy a blend of these tools that can help us through this? Because I feel really uncomfortably numb with
Yeah,
everything and the uncertainty. And I'm
yeah.
every day I'm trying to find the slivers of joy and fan them into something bigger, but I'm completely feeling guilty about
Well,
those
I have,
slivers of joy.
yeah, no, I am as well. I am as well. I have to say that there has never been a better time to be positive because that's exactly what the world needs. The truth is that positive psychology isn't about changing the world. It's about changing us individually and putting us in a better place to deal with the world as it is. And what you'll find is loads of people were putting their happiness off in the pandemic, thinking, I'll be happy when we come out of the pandemic. Then we go straight into a war in Ukraine. I'll be happy when Mr. Putin pulls out of Ukraine. So what happens is it's called destination addiction. We're kicking our happiness into the long grass. We're putting it off to some point in the future. And the truth is, if you're waiting for the perfect world in order to be happy, you will die waiting, right? Because when I don't want to spoil anybody's day here, but when Mr. Putin gives up or gets defeated or whatever, something else will crop up in the world somewhere. The world will always be imperfect. And rather than waiting for the world to be perfect, what we need to do is to be able to shine in an imperfect world. Can I give you, Desmond Tutu sadly died around Christmas time. And he tells, I don't know, probably not even his story, but at his eulogies, everybody was telling the same Desmond Tutu story. So let me go with it. Obviously, he tells it better than I'm about to tell it, but he tells a story about there's a raging river and there's a man standing by the river watching the river torrent by. And there's people in the river. Occasionally, there's a person in the river, and this person's going, help me, they're drowning. So the man, of course, jumps into the river, swims, rescues the person, drags them out, spluttering, but he's just revived that person. There's another person in the river. He's going, help me. So he jumps in again. Day after day after day, standing by the river, rescuing people who are drowning. And then Desmond Tutu says, like only Desmond Tutu can, there comes a point where we've got to stop jumping in the river and rescuing people and go upstream and find out why they're falling in. And honestly, I think that is where positive psychology really sits, is upstream. If we could learn some of these very simple tools and techniques to take care of your own well-being, to be more resilient, to be more stress resilient, to be more mindful, to be more grateful, all the things that come under positive psychology. If we knew how to do that better, then we might not fall in the river in the first place.
I had the good fortune to have an exclusive interview when I was like 22 years old, and all of the veterans of the media game in Toronto had to wait until my as live interview was done. It was a stellar moment in my career, I have to tell you.
Wowzer.
And
Well,
I
there
can
you go.
just
Yes,
imagine, I
yes,
can just imagine his eyes, the
yes,
playful way that he
yes.
would recount that. But the thing is, okay, Andy, I'm devil's advocate a little bit. I'm going to stir the soup a little bit. You say all that, but right now, how do we practically get there upstream?
How do we practically get there upstream? Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, there's so many things that we can learn to do. I mean, I hardly know where to start. My thing recently is that I've just discovered the true self-care thing, right? So most people understand self-care, and self-care has been talked about and talked about and talked about for 2 years now in the pandemic. You've got to look, so you can't pour from an empty jug. Everybody gets that, right? So you
Yeah.
can't give what you haven't got. So truthfully, I can't give my family love and compassion unless I first feel those things, right? So I literally can't give them that unless I feel it. So, and it sounds incredibly selfish, even when I'm about to say it, it makes me cringe. The best thing, the most important thing I will ever do for my family is to take really good care of me. Which again sounds so selfish, but it is the least selfish thing in the world. So now everybody understands that at a it's sort of a logical level. And what that meant for me for years and years and years was that I've got to take good care of myself right now. So I've got to say nice things about myself in my head instead of beating myself up, which is compassion. And I've got to maybe try and eat the right foods and try and get some good sleep and try and get some exercise. And for me, Susan, I tried to do that for 15 years and I failed and I failed and I failed, right? Because it was always a chore. So I was all right, yeah, I'm going to eat healthy until somebody opened a packet of biscuits. And then I'm like, well, somebody's got to eat them, and there seems to be 15 biscuits left, so I would wolf them down. Or I would like to go out on my bike for a ride or go out for a run, but it's drizzling, so it's too much effort, so I wouldn't. Now, therefore, this has changed my life about 2 years ago. What I realized is that true self care, so going upstream for me, true self care means this: it means all the aforementioned. It means being nice to myself in my head right now in this moment. It means eating good food. It means getting exercise and sleeping well in this moment right now, while also looking out for the well being of my future self. Right. So looking out for the well-being of myself tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year. And Susan, that second piece, that future self piece, has radically changed my life, right? Because it is now, I can't tell you how powerful this is, right? Because I now no longer have to diet. I no longer have to look after what I drink. I no longer have to try and make the effort to go out when it's drizzling for a run, because it makes perfect sense, because it's good for me tomorrow, it's good for me next week, it's good for me next month, it's good for me next year. If I eat 3 packets of biscuits every week, that's bad for my diabetes in 5 years' time. So all the effort of trying to look after myself, and it was a chore, and I would fail again and again, the effort is gone, because I'm now looking out for the well-being of my future self. Today's me is making good decisions that the future me is thanking me for. In fact, I
Well,
can
it's
see
sort
a
of too,
future
yeah.
version of me up there 10 years ago, and it's waving at me, a lovely healthy version of me in 10 years going, thanks Andy today for making good decisions.
But
The
I
effort's
think,
gone.
but I think, self-care, yeah, it means it's the rage now. We must self-care. And it brings to mind the oxygen mask dropping down
Yeah.
as the airplane plummets to the ground. I mean, you must put your own mask on first if you're going to be of any use at all to your family and your loved ones. But what I'm trying to do, because I'm still wanting your practical pointers on how to deal with the seesawing emotions, the welter of emotions we've got now, how do we come to terms with the limits of our own influence? We've got this eruption of emotions as we witness the intense suffering indirectly. We can donate immediately to a reputable charity, humanitarian organization. We can offer to take in refugees if we're able to do so, Ukrainian, and let's not forget Syrian. That's still raging, and we can we can even go further afield because there's no shortage of bad things happening in the world. And then I think we can end up having a kind of a form of survivor's guilt, as we curl into our beds with our comfy duvets and our freshly washed sheets, and we think about the people down in the bunkers and the bombed to smithereens in the maternity hospital. I mean, how do we, in our brain, psychologically balance out these
Well, but
competing
that's
thoughts?
always the case. That's always the case, is that there will always be somebody somewhere in the world having an absolutely dreadful time. There will always be a war. There was a war there's a war in Syria and a war in Yemen. But just because it's not on the news means that it's out of our sight and therefore out of our psyche, and we're not stressed out about it. As soon as it's in Europe, it becomes a European thing, and we're all of a sudden getting panicky about it. I think I mean, in terms of going upstream is actually a top tip in terms of looking after your future self, you making good choices now about your future self. One of those choices for me would be to reduce my news consumption. That doesn't mean that I've not got empathy and sympathy, and it doesn't mean that I don't care about the Ukrainians. It means that I can't do much about them right now. All I can do, and what positive psychology is makes me, I can be the best version of me in difficult circumstances. Now, if I can get that bit right and I can make some positive choices about me, then that might not help the Ukrainians, but it will certainly help the people closest to me. It will certainly create an uplift of emotion in morale in my family, and maybe create a wider ripple than that. And that's all I can do. That's all you can do. Right at the moment, certainly I can donate money, but that's the only thing that I can do. Is I can't solve the world. I can't make Mr. Putin change his mind. I can't make the pandemic go away. I can't make the sunshine. I can't make the buses run on time. Positive psychology is not about that. What I can do is upgrade me or keep myself on an even keel mentally, and keep my motivation reasonably high. That puts me in a better place to deal with Mr. Putin and the pandemic and a rainy day and a late bus. That's it. I can't change the world, but I can change me. I know that's classic self-help stuff, but it's true. The buck
But
stops and starts with me.
no, and in against your framing of positive psychology, I know we don't want to really get into, we don't want to become introduce the geopolitical side. I'm not asking you for punditry on that because there's enough speculation, God knows, out there.
Yeah.
But what do you think if you had to psychologically profile Vladimir Putin? What
Oh,
would you
Mr.
say?
Putin. Well, I mean, he's in trouble. He's mentally, he's not right, is he? He's got there's a thing called grandiose narcissism. So, I mean, narcissism is pretty bad. That's when you think you sort of, you're in love with yourself. Narcissus, I think, was it Greek?
Mm.
Before mirrors had been invented, Narcissus was quite a handsome young man. He looked in a puddle, saw his reflection, and fell in love with himself. So, the narcissism is that kind of you're your own number one fan. And that takes self-care and self-love to a ridiculous level, right? But grandiose narcissism is when you genuinely think that your ideas are the ones that matter. You are more gorgeous than anybody else. Your ideas are the better than anybody else's. You're the and the problem is when you put a grandiose narcissism person in charge of a nuclear button, then that's a real issue. That's a real problem. Okay, so it is actually a mental disorder. I mean, if you were going to take Mr. Putin, and there isn't a cream or a pill for it. So he's got that for sure. If you're going to diagnose him, he's mentally unhinged and unbalanced, which is a worry. Right? It is a genuinely worry because he's just slightly mad enough to do stupid things like he's
Yeah, it's
proving.
difficult. I think that's
Yeah,
what adds to the psychic numbing that's
yeah,
going on, the collective trauma, because we just don't know. Bashar al-Assad, we can feel that, okay, he's keeping it within his country, which is horrific and horrible, and we should be
yeah,
opening our hearts and minds and not shifting our gaze away from Syria. That's still underway. But with Putin, we just don't know the end game. And then, various of his commentariat, his aides go on and they seem to suggest that, oh, if there's an existential threat to Russia, well, yes, of course, we'd go nuclear. We'd use the nuclear option. You just think, oh
it's a
boy,
tough
and
one.
how
But
do you judge the
let me
existential
bring
threat?
let me again. If Mr. Putin hits a nuclear button, I mean, I'm not going to smile as the mushroom cloud goes up. Nobody's going to be happy. I'm not asking anybody to be happy. But let's come back to hope, right? So the Viktor Frankl stuff. Viktor Frankl very famously wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He was a survivor of either, I think it was Auschwitz or Belsen, so a Holocaust survivor. Um, and he came up with and he said he's called it logotherapy. So when he survived it and he came back and he became a doctor and he did logotherapy. And logotherapy is essentially the science of hope. Um, and what he found was that it wasn't survival of the fittest in the concentration camps. It was as soon as you'd lost hope, there were men who were bigger and more physically stronger than him, who would just die overnight because they'd lost hope. And he says the thing that if you all you had to cling on to was hope. And in fact, that if you take that forward, there was another one. I think it was Jim Stockdale in the Vietnam War. That the highest ranking American um, general that got captured by the Vietnamese. And imagine that as the highest ranking in a concentration camp, he's going to have a hard time. So he got the worst torture and the worst treatment of everybody, and yet he survived. And when he came out of that prisoner camp after 7 years of being tortured by the Vietnamese, they said, "Well, how did you survive?" And he basically said that he never gave up hope. He says the ones who died, they thought they'll be out by Christmas. Christmas came, Christmas went, they weren't out. Well, we might be out by Easter. Easter came, Easter went, they weren't out. They literally died of
Despair.
lack of hope. Yeah, despair. They'd lost hope. And he said the wavering thing. So the Stockdale paradox, as it is now called, is it's two things. First of all, it is an unrelenting belief that we can get through whatever life is throwing at us. And the second thing he talked about was, I forgot what his second thing was. It's essentially that everything is temporary. So it will be temporary. There will be an end to it, and we will get through it. And he said, if you can hang on to those two things, that became known as the Stockdale paradox. It's very similar to the Viktor Frankl thing about hope. So let's not lose hope. All right, that's the one thing we can do for the Ukrainians is not lose our own hope. Otherwise we'll be on a downer as well, and then that's not going to do anybody any good.
So we need to adapt and be resilient about hope and find the optimism and not look away, clock it, restrict our news consumption, be well aware of what's going on, but also tend to our own lives and deliver as much happiness as we can to the people who are in our lives.
Yeah, yeah. Well, absolutely. That's it. That's what positive psychology is, right there. You just articulated about 12 years of my research there in that last sort of paragraph. But I think, can I just give one more thing before we go? And that is about not joining in with the conversations that are out there that are not that the general hubbub. You said at the start, everybody's talking about it, right? Everybody's talking about the pandemic, and then everybody's talking about the Ukraine situation. And what happens is human beings, we're gregarious, we're pack animals, we're social creatures. We have this baked in need to belong. So 10,000 years ago, a lone human being on the African savannah was a dead human being. So we literally need, you can't survive on your own. For your physical and emotional security, you need a tribe, a clan, a community. Therefore, what we do is we look around and we watch and we listen and we join in with what everybody else is saying because we want to fit in. We feel ostracized and if we don't fit in. So it's a human need to fit in. So if everybody else is talking about the war and Putin and panicking about the nuclear button and talking about the COVID stats going the wrong way and just feeding back what they've seen on the news, it feels like the most natural thing in the world is to join in with that general negative hubbub. And therefore, positive psychology, being a two percenter, as I call them, the ones at the top end of the well-being spectrum, you've got to be brave enough and not join in those conversations or begin to reframe them and talk about something different. Okay, I mean it sounds
But
obvious,
I see,
but
I
talk
would
about something
challenge that.
different.
My immediate viewpoint would be, oh, it's really good to vent. It's really good to have these discussions. And, it's good to maybe damp down some of the know-it-alls that endlessly speculate about how it's going to end and this and that. And they're coming from, armchair generals that don't really know any more than you've heard on the BBC World Service. So, but I would have thought it was a good thing to a degree
It,
to
it,
allow people
it's
to vent with you.
the problem with venting is that what you end up doing is dragging the person down that you're venting to. They might be having a perfectly good day till you start to talk about bad stuff, right? And then you've knocked them off their perch and they've joined you down there. I've got no problem with venting, right? If it's warranted and it's genuine. If here's the thing, Susan, right? Most people, 95% of what we grumble about is absolute trivial nonsense, right? Grumbling, particularly for the Brits, don't know about the Canadians, but for the Brits, it's a habit. It's nothing more than a habit. And if you can stop 95% of your low-level grumbling conversations, then I'm not saying don't have a moan and don't join in with that sometimes. But if your habit is not to join in with the general negativity, then when you do have a grumble, people will listen to you because it's out of character. But if you're just generally joining in with the negativity out there, nobody's really listening. It might feel good for you to vent, but the person you're venting
I
to,
was thinking of a group vent. I wasn't thinking about
yeah,
me
yeah, yeah,
imposing
yeah,
the
yeah, but
subject all of a sudden. Everyone's
okay,
talking
okay.
about the
Oh no, fair
daffodils,
enough.
and
Yeah.
oh, here comes Susan talking
All right. No,
about
no,
the
no. All right. Well,
pulverization of Ukraine.
no, if we downgrade it from the pulverization of Ukraine to like your journey home of an evening, right? How
Mm.
often, seriously, how often do the viewers and the listeners to this get home and go, "How was your day?" "Oh, don't talk to me about my day. What a nightmare." And I'm saying, well, was it really a bad day, or was it a bad 5 minutes that you are now milking all day? The vast majority of a day will have been brilliant, and you're saving the bit that went wrong to share with the people you love the most. So what I'm saying is, instead of doing that, you're coming home and daring to ask your family, what's the highlight of your day? What's the very best thing kids you've learned at school, or the funniest thing that's happened today? And by changing the narrative, not becoming a victim of the habit that we just join in with negativity and come through the door and offloading all your detritus on the people you love the most, is coming home and being a better version of you. And that is boom, out the ballpark, because that's what psychology teaches you to
Yeah, well,
do.
that's in the first episode. We can direct people back. Your 4 minute rule, presenting yourself as your best self for just 4 minutes all the time. Now, here comes Smudge. Arlo
Hey,
will
it's
be
much.
along any minute. I made room on the desk, so there he. Smudgy, come on.
You
Okay.
see, life is okay again. All of a
Oh,
sudden, everything's
listen.
okay.
Yeah, and here
Everything's
comes
okay.
Arlo. Here comes Arlo. One, there's always two. Listen, I want to end. You mentioned the love word, and you have a thing about doing a proper hug, the power
Oh,
of a
yes.
proper hug. And I would love you, here they're gonna have a proper fight. I would love you to give us the Dr. Andy Cope, Dr. Happy hug
Okay.
rules, and we can
Yes.
send one out to
All
everyone
right. All right. We'll
everywhere.
finish with this. It's a beautiful thing, actually. And if you don't delve into the science too much, just trust me, it just works. All right. So I don't know if you're a huggy person, Susan, whether you're a hugger, but I wasn't.
100%, of course.
Okay, so I wasn't until I learned this, right? So essentially, this is how it goes. So if you are a huggy person, the average hug lasts 2.1 seconds. So if you're a hugger or you watch huggy people, it will be like one, two, finish. That's how long an average hug will last, about that long, right? But here's the game changer, is that in order for the love to transfer between two people, then a hug actually needs to last 7 seconds or longer, which I know it's a long time. For the non-huggers, that's not, well, that's a long time, right? Now, obviously, not strangers in the park because there is a pandemic out there right now. So let's be careful with it.
Well,
But
I
there,
think
in
we
fact,
all need some new programming when it comes to hugging. We all
well,
need
we
to have, cautious hugging. How long does that last?
yeah, well, I think well, there'll be 12 people in your life. The science is quite clear on that. There'll be between 12 and 15 people. You could think of them right now, close family, close friends. If you wrote them down, your homework after listening to this is to administer some 7 second hugs just with those 12 people when it's appropriate. And obviously don't count out loud and all that because that's going to spoil it. But I think, and let's leave you with a really, really serious point. So, I mean, it's been quite a serious podcast all the way through, to be fair, but with some really heavy topics in there. But after 2 and a bit years in a pandemic, we've been socially distanced and we've been socially isolated for 2 whole years. And the truth is that human beings, we are social creatures. And therefore, what the world actually does need and what it's craving out for is some love. So if you can't solve the Ukraine situation, you can treat somebody in your 12 to a 7 second hug and just hang on to them. That's just long enough for the love to transfer. You don't have to say, I love you. The hug is just long enough for them intuitively to know that you love them.
Oh, I love that. It's long enough for the love to transfer. You are so amazing. Dr. Andy Cope, the purveyor of positivity, of a beautiful comic wrapping. He is known far and wide, as you know, from the first episode we did about a year ago as Dr. Happy. Find his wonderfully helpful blogs, books, workshops at artofbrilliance.co.uk. I truly hope that this conversation has helped settle you down, calm your anxiety, and given you some pointers about how you can hang on to hope and optimism. Thank you so much, Dr. Andy Cope, for coming on again to rushing to the rescue of all of us. Thank you so much.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.